The debate over the possible delivery of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine has become one of the most sensitive topics in negotiations about the war's future, placing Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow in a strategic game of pressures and counterpressures. U.S. President Donald Trump has oscillated between threatening to send these missiles and expressing reservations about depleting American stockpiles, while Vladimir Putin has transformed the Tomahawk into the Kremlin's latest red line. What the Tomahawk missile can do. The Tomahawk represents one of the most mature and versatile cruise missile systems in the American arsenal, with proven operational capability spanning over 4 decades. The missile can strike targets with precision of approximately 5 meters from distances up to 2,500 kilometers for some variants, though more common versions have a range of 1,600 kilometers. The BGM-109 Tomahawk system operates at extremely low altitudes, between 30 and 90 meters, making it difficult to detect by conventional radar systems. With a speed of approximately 885 kilometers per hour, equivalent to a commercial aircraft, the missile uses a sophisticated combination of navigation systems, GPS, TERCOM, terrain contour matching, and DSMAC, digital scene matching area correlation, allowing it to follow complex routes while evading air defenses. The Block 4 version, the only one still in production, adds capabilities essential for modern conflict. It can be reprogrammed in flight via satellite communications, can loiter over a target area for hours, and can transmit battle damage assessment imagery back to commanders. The conventional warhead of 450 kilograms equals approximately 400 pounds of TNT, sufficient to destroy critical infrastructure and fortified military installations. Since 1991, the United States and its allies have launched over 2,300 Tomahawk missiles in combat operations, from Iraq and Afghanistan to Syria, Libya, and most recently in Yemen against Houthi rebels in 2024. This extensive operational experience makes the Tomahawk a proven weapons system, unlike experimental systems. For Ukraine, the Tomahawk would represent a substantial qualitative leap over current capabilities. Currently, Kyiv relies on long-range cruise drones and indigenous missiles that, while having impressive ranges, carry payloads of only 10 to 100 kilograms and fly at reduced speeds, making them vulnerable to interception and limiting destructive power. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War have identified at least 1,945 Russian military targets within range of the 2,500-kilometer Tomahawk variant and 1,655 targets for the 1,600-kilometer version. Priority targets include the Shahed drone factory in Yelabuga, Republic of Tatarstan, and the Engels II air base in Saratov region, from which Russia launches strategic bombers for cruise missile attacks against Ukraine. The long-range capabilities of American Tomahawk missiles and their substantial payload will allow Ukrainian forces to inflict significant damage on key Russian military installations located deep inside Russia. ISW analysts stated, "The ability to strike ammunition depots, command centers, logistics nodes, and military production facilities deep inside Russian territory could change the war's strategic calculus." Implementation challenges. However, the actual transfer of Tomahawk systems to Ukraine faces significant obstacles. First, logistical issues. Tomahawk was originally designed for launch from ships and submarines using the Mark 41 vertical launch system. Ukraine does not possess a fleet capable of operating these missiles from the sea. The technical solution already exists, the Typhon system, rapidly developed by the U.S. Army after the collapse of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. Typhon represents a mobile platform, truck-mounted, integrating 4 Mark 41 vertical launch cells in a 40-foot container. The system has been successfully tested and operationally deployed to the Philippines, Australia, and Japan in 2024, demonstrating its portability and effectiveness. Ukrainian forces could operate Typhon relatively quickly. Experience with HIMARS in 2022 demonstrated Ukrainian military ability to adapt to American mobile launch systems in within weeks. The implementation period would be approximately 1 to 2 months for full operationalization. However, the biggest obstacle remains missile availability. Estimates indicate the United States holds between 3,500 and 4,150 Tomahawk missiles in stock after producing approximately 9,000 since the 1980s. Of these, over 2,300 have been used in combat operations, and in 2024-2025 alone, at least 135 to 200 missiles were launched against Houthi rebels in Yemen. The critical problem is production rate. Currently, only 5 missiles per month are manufactured, with annual orders of 55 to 90 missiles, and the Pentagon budget for 2026 provides for purchasing only 57 missiles. At this rate, the American industrial system cannot compensate for operational consumption, much less provide hundreds of missiles to Ukraine without affecting U.S. Navy operational readiness. "We cannot deplete our country's reserves," Trump declared, underlining the administration's strategic dilemmas. U.S. officials cited by Reuters confirmed that Tomahawk transfer to Ukraine is unlikely precisely because of limited stockpiles and competing operational priorities, especially in the Pacific, where the Trump administration sees a higher priority. Mark Cancian, senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, warned that even if transfer were approved, American industry could not respond quickly. Each Tomahawk missile requires 2 years of production time due to slow manufacturing rates and production bottlenecks for key components like rocket motors. Why the Kremlin fears this? The Kremlin's reaction to the possibility of Tomahawk delivery to Ukraine has been unusually vehement, even by the standards of Russian nuclear rhetoric over the past 3 years of war. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov acknowledged that the Tomahawk issue causes extreme concern in Moscow and that the war has entered a dramatic moment. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev issued a direct nuclear warning. It is impossible to distinguish a nuclear Tomahawk from a conventional one in flight. Delivery of these missiles could end badly for everyone, and especially for Trump himself. Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko repeated the same narrative. Tomahawks will not solve the problem. They will escalate the situation toward nuclear war. Russia's fears are rooted in concrete operational realities. Russia currently enjoys a sanctuary behind its lines from which it can launch attacks against Ukraine without fear of significant reprisals against deep military infrastructure. Ukrainian drones have caused considerable damage. Approximately 40% of Russia's refining capacity remains offline due to Ukrainian attacks. But these systems carry small payloads and are relatively slow, limiting destruction against fortified targets. Tomahawk would eliminate this sanctuary. With its range, the missile could strike Moscow from deep inside Ukrainian-controlled territory, the distance of approximately 800 kilometers being well within the system's capabilities. More importantly, it would enable destruction of weapons factories, strategic ammunition depots, and air bases from which Russia launches its attacks. The Institute for the Study of War assessed that striking these targets behind Russian lines could significantly degrade Russia's battlefield performance on the front line. Ukrainian military experts argue that Tomahawk could paralyze a series of Russian weapons factories and would place substantial economic and military pressure on the Kremlin. Moscow has tried to minimize the threat, with Putin claiming that Tomahawk does not present a serious threat and Russian air defenses are fully capable of intercepting them. But this narrative is contradicted by evidence from previous theaters of operations. In Syria, in 2017 and 2018, Russian and Syrian systems reported massive interceptions of Tomahawk missiles launched by the United States. But independent analyses found that most missiles reached their targets. Andrei Kovalenko from Ukraine's Center for Counter-Disinformation emphasized that Tomahawk effectiveness derives from its low flight altitude and complex navigation system, which makes it difficult to detect by interception. even Western experts acknowledge that Russian S-400 and Panzer systems remain inadequate to counter Tomahawk-class cruise missiles, especially when used in coordinated salvo attacks, where multiple missiles are launched simultaneously to overwhelm defenses. The Russian radar chain for low-altitude target detection is not dense enough to ensure effective defense across the entire territory. Kremlin nuclear threats in the Tomahawk context must be viewed through the lens of a consistent behavioral pattern throughout the war. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Moscow has used nuclear rhetoric to deter direct NATO military intervention and discourage Western military assistance to Ukraine. Strategic studies experts note that Russia has repeatedly established red lines, from supplying tanks and air defense systems to ATCMS missiles and striking Russian territory without taking concrete action when these lines were crossed. It is easy to understand why Moscow so vehemently opposes the idea of sending Tomahawks to Ukraine. The real question is whether Russia's threats deserve to be taken seriously, the Atlantic Council concludes. However, nuclear warnings cannot be completely ignored. Graham Allison argued in 2023 that Putin might consider justified the first use of tactical nuclear weapons based on Russian military doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, especially if he considers his regime's survival in danger. This strategic uncertainty is exactly what the Kremlin tries to exploit to prevent Tomahawk transfer. The diplomatic dynamic around Tomahawk has become a barometer of the Trump administration's strategic positioning. The American president has repeatedly suggested that the missiles could be used as leverage to force Russia to negotiations. Quote, "If this war does not end, I will send Tomahawks." However, after a phone call with Putin on October 16, 2025, Trump announced an upcoming summit in Budapest, and his rhetoric about Tomahawk became considerably tempered. The choice of Budapest as meeting location is significant. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, one of the few European leaders maintaining cordial relations with Moscow, enthusiastically welcomed the summit prospect. Quote, "We are ready." Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky left his October 18th meeting with Trump without concrete commitments regarding Tomahawk, though he noted that it is good that Trump did not say no. Media reports suggest the meeting atmosphere was more tense than initially presented, with Trump warning Zelensky that Putin could destroy Ukraine if he does not accept proposed terms. Ian Lesser from the German Marshall Fund in Brussels assessed that no decision will be made regarding the Tomahawk situation before the Trump-Putin meeting, suggesting Washington seeks justifications not to advance beyond simply threatening transfer of long-range systems. Against the backdrop of uncertainties regarding Western assistance, Ukraine has accelerated its own programs for developing long-range strike capabilities. In August 2025, Ukraine announced the Flamingo cruise missile with a reported range of 3,000 kilometers and a 1,150-kilogram warhead. Although testing is not yet complete and mass production requires time for scaling up, Flamingo represents a significant evolution. President Zelensky announced that Ukrainian armed forces will receive 30,000 long-range and deep strike weapons in 2025, a projection that seemed optimistic at the time of announcement but now appears to be materializing. Ukraine already produces long-range cruise drones like AN-196 Luty, FP-1, UJ-26 Bober, and mini-cruise missiles like Ruta and Peklo. Work on the Korshun ground attack cruise missile based on inherited Soviet X-55 technology also continues, weapons experts report. However, all these indigenous systems remain in the light weapons category, with reduced payloads and slow subsonic speeds, which limits lethality against strategic fortified targets. The Tomahawk debate transcends purely military aspects, representing a broader dispute about the nature of Western commitment to Ukraine and acceptable escalation limits with Russia. For the Kremlin, preventing Tomahawk transfer is essential for maintaining strategic advantage behind the lines and limiting Ukraine's ability to disrupt Russian military operations in depth. For Ukraine, obtaining these capabilities would represent not just an improvement in strike power, but also a crucial political signal of lasting U.S. commitment. For the Trump administration, Tomahawk has become a bargaining chip in a complex game involving balancing pressure on Russia, managing its own military stockpiles, and prioritizing strategic competition with China in the Pacific. Mark Cancian summarizes the strategic calculus. If the United States can release a few hundred Tomahawks and the Ukrainians target Russian energy installations, this could cause enough damage to Russia to encourage negotiations. However, logistical constraints, stockpile limitations, and political uncertainties make this prospect remain speculative. In the coming weeks, the Trump-Putin Budapest summit will clarify whether Tomahawk becomes an operational reality for Ukraine or remains an unused diplomatic lever. For now, the missile worrying the Kremlin remains more a potential threat than a concrete presence on the battlefield. Exactly the kind of strategic ambiguity that all parties are trying to exploit to their advantage.
Ați ascultat Cuculix.
Adevărul dincolo de zgomot.
В настоящее время никто не может ответить на ваш звонок. Поэтому оставьте сообщение после тонального сигнала. По окончании записи нажмите на символ решетки.